All right, here we go.
How are
There we
we?
go.
Are you well?
Wonderfully well, thank you. As you can see, the environment's a little bit more sanitized.
I said I'd take the opportunity, the good weather, to come outside. Just even the glare off the sun, it's so bloody sunny. If you can see my face, that'll die down though, you know?
Wonderful.
Yeah. No, take advantage of the good nights, I think.
Absolutely. Time is precious. Got to seize the moment. And there's no point in dithering, twiddling our thumbs.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for coming on for a second chat. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed our first chat, you see.
Right.
And I was up in Dublin Whiskey Live, and there was a Dream Drams bar hosted by Celtic Whiskey Shop. And I bought a few what I think is fairly special scotches. I said, what am I going to, I just took the opportunity because they were so cheap. And I said, what am I going to do with them? Because I'd like to find out more. And I said, who better to get on and have a chat about closed, silent Scottish distilleries, because it's not something I know much about, you know. So I'll be leaning heavily on tonight, Ralfy, to give me a history lesson. Pick your brains.
No problems. Happy to do so. So I'm kind of curious, how much did they charge you for these unicorn bottles?
Now, saying that, I actually have the receipt here because I thought you might ask. So I have a Glenougie 1970, which is 42 years old. And I paid $13.50 for a 10 cl measure of that.
Right. So it's 10, it's not a full bottle.
No. Dream drams. So they were just doing small little drams of these kind of unicorn bottles.
Yes.
So little tasters.
Yeah.
And I had a Glenlockie 1979. I paid €15.90 for a 10 cl of that. And actually, I lie. I got 2 cls of the Glenougie 1970 for $12.50. So that was really good value, I thought.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then I got a Glenlockie 1979. That was a 10 cl as well, €15.90. Not bad.
Absolutely.
I took the opportunity.
Yeah, quite right too, because the thing is that more range of experiences we have, the more we can refine our bearings and know from the memory bank that builds up from that experience, just where whiskey is at when we buy it now from the retailers, having just been bottled by the distillers and put out, and we get beyond the contemporary point of reference. And although we factor in with these old bottlings and samples of these old bottlings that we have to recalibrate slightly because they are antiquities, therefore they will have that old bottle effect. But the best way to view them is actually go back in the timeline to, for example, 1979, and whatever you were doing then, you use that period as a point of reference if you'd arrived yet.
81, right? Ralfy, 81.
Right. Well, I was at school. In fact, I was in my last year at school. It was definitely a very different generation. No computer, no internet, and these bottlings were basically small-scale novelties that nobody was particularly interested in, because at that particular point, Scotch in Scotland was dominated primarily by Macallan, Glenfiddich, and Glenmorangie, who were more presenting out into the market their particular brands, and most of the others who were in production were really producing as blend filler and selling as and where they could to keep themselves ticking over. And of course, when you've got distilleries that have shut down, they didn't tick over, they lost their business.
Yeah.
And partly it could be because of the competency of the whiskey in, for example, Glenweavis, good example. which was a really poor whiskey because they got the shapes of the stills wrong.
Okay.
And then years and years and years later, the stills get bought by Springbank Distillery and used at Kilkerran, having been significantly altered in shape to get the proportions right. And then you get fabulous whiskey. But other
is that regular in the Scotch whiskey industry, where they would have given a second life to stills when they close the distillery?
Well, yes, because stills are valuable commodities. The price of a set of stills now, 2 or 3 stills for a distillery, you're bouncing off £1 million if you're going to get them from Forsyths. And of course, they have a huge waiting list.
Yeah.
They can basically charge within reason, they can charge what they like. And as a result of which, if a pair of second-hand stills comes onto the market, a distillery is going to snap them up.
Yeah.
Because they are valuable commodities. Certainly in other distilleries, for example, Rosebank, the stills just allegedly disappeared. But there again, allegedly, they turned up in China.
Oh,
despite the fact that the official media release was suggesting that thieves had got in during the night and cut up the stills because of the aftermarket price of copper, which is pretty weird when you're trying to still saw a copper still, because it's going to make an absolute racket. And secondly, when this closed distillery is surrounded by cameras and clearly has security in operation, frankly, that reason just comes across as fake. It's unbelievable.
In Ireland, we're still kind of fledgling in our resurgence. Yes, we've always had a whiskey industry here, but you're only talking about 2 or 3 and then 4 major distilleries here, or any distilleries for that fact, up until 14 years ago or so. We saw Mark Rainier bring Inverleven stills to Bruichladdich, have them as really, really expensive garden ornaments, and then uproot them and bring them to Waterford and actually put them into production. So we haven't seen the kind of reuse of stills, or we haven't experienced the closing of distilleries in recent history, of the, we'll say 42 current Irish distilleries who are distilling Irish whiskey. We haven't seen any of them close yet, or them being amalgamated or bought up by Diageo or any of the big lads just yet. Maybe the first one actually we've just seen in Sligo. Sazerac have just bought a distillery in Sligo in the west of Ireland. So this is the first kind of big takeover of a kind of a multinational. So it's very interesting to see that to learn from the Scotch whiskey industry about what was happening, what has happened, what will happen inevitably to the Irish industry, I think,
Yeah, well, you've obviously put some thought into it, Laurie, because there will be takeovers. And the reason for this is corporate multinational positioning. If you're not in, you're left out. And the corporate multinationals have huge budgets and find it very easy to borrow money because of the collateral. This is just the reality of it. To a certain extent, it's always happened, but now it tends to happen faster and harder and much more visibly, because you now have a whiskey audience who are far more informed, far more educated and articulate, and in fact are often the first to know. Because of basically, excuse the pun, leaks at the distillery. And it wouldn't surprise me if Waterford sold to Diageo. Just give you my perspective here. That would not surprise me.
Have you seen a multinational come in and take over a successful distillery successfully? Like, has it continued on from when a multinational has come in? Is there instances of that in the Scotch whiskey industry?
Frankly, no. because
Really? Oh,
corporations have a way of working. They do not produce whiskey the way a small private consortium or individual does in a small distillery.
yeah.
It seems superficial and it seems relatively unimportant, but corporations will always cut costs and homogenize production. They will bring in their marketing team who always want something to do to keep their position because they're building castles.
Yeah.
They're always building castles. They want their finger in the pie. So they'll turn up having taken over a small distillery and they'll hand over the rule book that never existed before, apart from a mission statement and a mutual policy of agreement, which led to a group of relatively enthusiastic people getting up to their necks in debt to follow their dreams and do the best they could. And it's the small producers who will literally, someone will jump in a lorry and they'll head over to Europe and they'll make a few phone calls and they'll turn up at a winery or a small bodega house somewhere in Spain, and they'll be able to have a smattering of Spanish. So they'll, before the day's out, they've had a good drink, they've handed over a few gifts of a bottle of whiskey, and they've got a lorry full of really good casks.
Yeah.
Because there's that personal contact has been made, and it's important. And with corporations, it just doesn't exist. It's not part of their game plan. They simply can't do it. So when large companies take over small companies, the assumption is things will remain the same. And I can assure you from my experience, that is absolutely not the case. It doesn't happen despite all the best intentions. But the general assumption is, well, at least the distillery will be safe with a corporate multinational, which is another illusion that's created. But you've got small successful distilleries. They have been bought over. They soldier on. Bruichladdich, for example, it's soldiering on. But the big question now is, well, we really enjoy the Port Charlotte. There's some few interesting non-age statement local barley Bruichladichs, but where the hell's the rest of the whiskey? What are they doing with it? We know they've got warehouses stuffed with the whiskey. Why aren't they bottling it? Why aren't they bringing it onto the market? The 10-year-old, the 12-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 18-year-old, the 21-year-old, the 25-year-old, where is it? So what are they doing? One can only presume that having paid an enormous amount of money to buy over a distillery, the new owners have got to say, right, we want our money back fast. How can we turn our premium product into an even more premium product? And I think with Bruichladdich, what they're doing is they're just refusing to release their whiskey until it's got massive big age statements on it. And then they can put it out in the new category deluxe international market where you can't buy it unless you're starting at 10,000 euros or something absurd. And you see this showboating that's going on recently with Ardbeg, who claim they've just sold a cask of 1979. There we are, that's that year again, funny that. Ardbeg to a Chinese business person for £15 million, a single cask. It's absurd, it's just ridiculous. And frankly, this is playing games with the industry. I don't think it's very smart. It's what you're dealing with is absurdism. And this is something the corporations, the big corporate multinationals, because of their overly empowered and sophisticated marketing departments, they're bringing these people in because it's to give them their place and to help to justify their very substantial salaries. And they are tarting up whiskey. They are faking up the genuine message that whiskey should have and replacing it with something that's fake, disingenuous, and full of bullshit. And it's just pissing people off. You can already see customers, loyal customers, being pushed away from Ardbeg, for example, with the new Ardcore range bottled for Fish Day. The
I
people,
I really enjoyed that video actually you put out there on Patreon this week as well about that hardcore bottling. There's not many people kind of have the cojones to speak out in such a fashion and say their opinion as strongly as you, with such gravity, in that you have so much experience in the Scotch whiskey industry, you know, experiencing it as a fan, as even as an educator online for the past, is it 12 years now, 11 years, Ralph?
since 2009, so I'm into my
Yeah.
13th year. Yeah.
I mean, I can, I definitely credit you with probably at least 40% of my whiskey knowledge. I have thoroughly enjoyed all of your content since I started drinking the nectar of the gods a couple of years ago. And I really respect the balls on you, you know, to call people out in such a passionate way. I really do, like, you know.
Someone needs to say it.
Mm.
It's not so much what I say, it's the sheer volume of people who understand whiskey and who have more than a superficial consumer connectivity to whiskey. People that the whiskey industry really, really needs. And it really needs the ongoing support because we're moving into a global recession. And it's a complex one. The experts they don't know what shape it's going to take. But this is really the first international global recession, which is going to be broadcast live because the internet will let it happen. And then people will see, if people want to watch television, they'll get that version. They'll get the marketing version of propaganda. But for people behind the scenes with experience, it doesn't take you long to find out what you really want to know. And you can make up your own mind without being a conspiracy theorist. You're just acknowledging, well, actually, conspiracies, funnily enough, they really do happen. And there's no harm in theorizing about it now and again, just because it makes the practice of identifying them all the sharper. And you can see some pretty sharp practice, by the way, with the owners of Ardbeg. And who goodness knows, I've not actually tasted it yet, Ardcore. Here's me giving a great big comment on it. And I've not even tasted it for a simple reason. I'm just not prepared to go out because the prices are 150 quid a bottle.
The reviews aren't great either off lads who know what they're talking about either as well.
Yeah, this is a huge amount of money for what they're actually offering. Sure, I've got a malt mate who's going to send me a sample, but all I did was with this particular instance, but you'll find it repeats with the corporate multinationals because they have what's called their wood policy, and it's not a true wood policy. It is not a proper old school cask policy, and it's the small independent distilleries, if they have the resources or even are prepared to pull together, who are actually going to keep real whiskey alive.
Well, that's what I was hoping to explore tonight with you in trying some of these older whiskies and maybe get a bit of an education from you, because, I mean, this Glenougie, I'm going to start with the Glenougie from 1970. I mean, yeah. These are old casks. I mean, what should I expect from the casks that this whiskey was matured in from Glenougie?
Right, Joe.
And I'm going to pour a drop there for myself. I'm sorry I can't share one with you.
No, don't worry about it. I've got a nice wee glass of Arden Machrimur.
Lovely.
But funnily enough, I've just gone out to the bothy and I've got myself an old 1970s, early 1980s bottling of Inverlochy Castle, which is in fact Ben Nevis.
Okay,
and
right.
It's a very good illustrative example. Now, to be honest, Laurie, my nose is a little bit bunged up at the moment with the summer sniffles. But what I can tell you is this: to continue a whiskey journey, you want to find some of these old whiskey books that you can occasionally pick up on eBay or in the bookshops, or even secondhand. Somewhere in Dublin, for example, the secondhand bookshops, they'll have books on whiskey. And they contain information which often doesn't appear in the modern books, right? So they contain illustrations that shows you the traditional pan-shaped shape of Irish copper stills, the large size of Irish stills, which with the triple distillation, and not always, but frequent triple distillation, created a refined, good quality, flavoursome whiskey, which basically kicked Scotch whiskey into touch. But the thing is that back in the days, there wasn't a huge volume produced. With the Scotch whiskey industry introducing column stills seriously in an industrial scale, you had a significant increase, not only in the volume of Scotch whiskey, blended whiskey produced, but an increase by default in the quality. It wasn't, frankly, as rough. And a lot of malt whiskey in the old days was really quite rough because it was made under, I mean, a lot of pot still whiskey, industrially made, it was rushed out because it was all about counting the pennies. And if you wanted the good stuff, you had to go to the hoochers, the illicit stillers, who had far more experience, who understood the feng shui of the landscape, the location, and the choice of quality water in the production of the usquevé. And they had no problem selling it because it was refined, smooth, solid, flavoursome liquor, which would go into the bars, and the bars that held on to the reputation didn't adulterate it with sulfuric acid and vinegar and cheap wash, whereas the bars that just wanted to pad it out, they'd basically adulterate left, right, and centre, and people were just knocking it back to get hammered. I mean, we'd sentimentalize about it now, but this was real in the old days. People had very little in their lives, so getting absolutely whacked on a Friday night in the bar, drinking a large volume of cheap liquor, that made your weekend.
Highlight of the week, yeah. And all the more lucky if you were entitled to your grog as well, if you happen to work in your local distillery, you know. All the better.
Half the time, it wasn't allowed. It was simply tolerated because wages were so poor and conditions were so rough that, it's a back-breaking work, rolling and stacking casks, because in those days there were no forklifts, so it was all handballed. If they were lucky, they had a pony at the end of the hoist to help hoist up the barrels on ropes. And that's the way they did it. But the wages were crap. And they would steal whiskey. And again, this was tolerated because it was super cheap to make, for the simple reason that if they managed to sneak out some liquor, they could swap it with the neighbour for some vegetables or for some beer. Or half the time they just have their own beer out the distillery. They just use the wash and they just let it settle a bit, and that was their beer. But a very, very different landscape. And you get to know this when you read the books, and it gives you a timeline, so that when we go to auction or we go to the specialist shops that give you these old bottles cut into little mini samples so you can taste it, it expands our consciousness of awareness of the flavors of whiskey, because we now have that direct access to the historical timeline. And we, having read a wee bit up in the books, we know that in that age, right, back 1970s, right, take the 1970s. So you've got a bottle of whiskey and it was bottled at the late 1970s and it's got an age statement on it. We'll say it was 20 years old. So immediately that tells us that in 1979, it was bottled and it was 20 years old. So it was actually distilled in 1959 or possibly earlier, because in order to sell the whiskey, they would actually bottle older stuff and put a younger age statement on it, so as it really came across as what was a liqueur whiskey, because so few people were interested. In the 1970s, of course, was the age vodka was fashionable. People were still drinking sweet and dry sherries. People were into baby sham. Remember that?
I do.
Make mine a baby sham. People wanted lager. These were the new fashionable drinks.
West Coast cooler.
Absolutely. Foster's, for example. Oh my goodness, and the idea, of
That was
course,
trendy. That was exotic.
It was exotic. And of course, the whole idea was to, at that point, you had start of the big companies who realized the less flavor we bottle, the more people will have a flavor they quite like. Because if we have a flavorsome drink, some people won't like it. Whereas if we have a flavorless drink, everybody will like it because they're buying the label, they're buying the brand. Foster's, classic example. Because, why would you buy a can of Foster's? Because you don't want a warm beer. It's got to be chilled. Of course, it's got to be chilled because it's to make up for the fact that there's very little flavor in it.
Yeah.
The more cool it is, the less it tastes like pish.
Yeah.
And this
I bought a bottle at auction last week. It was a bottle of old 1970s black and white Scotch. I got it for €23. I said, sure, I'll because I was after buying a few bottles, so I tagged it along as a kind of an old cheapie. Threw in a cheeky bit, got it, and I cracked it open, and it's not great. It's not great. It's like, yeah, and it's not cheesy, but it's definitely, after losing some of its 40% ABV, and it's gone a bit diesely. Yeah, it's gone a bit solventy, it's 23 quid. I took a punt. I was paying for postage anyway, so I may as well have tacked it on,
Right.
So what you're saying, to your point, that a lot of the older whiskey, just because it's old, doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or it's going to be great.
You will find in particular blended whiskey. So a combination, if there's corn in it, corn doesn't seem to weather in bottles terribly well.
Really? Okay.
Really.
So what about older bourbons? Have you found that, like, have you drunk older bourbons and found that with older bourbons?
Yes, I've found that they're quite competent, particularly if the sour mash is more prominent. It's got more singularity. It's got more identity. But what really weathers well is rye whiskey. Rye in bottle, in glass, beautifully well.
Okay.
Very, very well. So if you're buying Scotch whiskies at auction and Irish whiskies at auction, you really want to go for single malts or blended malts, also known as pure malts.
Yeah.
They tend to weather in the glass far more successfully. But hey, you've got the experience of that. So you've got a bottle of blend there. It's a bit rank. You know the solution, don't you? Just top up with Lafroig.
Do you know what? That was my little trick for years with Green Spot. I used to love topping in maybe 5 or 10 mils, a few teaspoons of Lafroig on top of a Green Spot. A peated pot still is just amazing. One of my little tricks. Really enjoy it. But I always have a bottle of Lafroig there just to kind of peat up one of my pot still whiskies. This is what I'm drinking here, Ralfy, is the Glenougie. So I took a few little notes there just to let people know. It's the Glenougie 1970. Am I right in saying that? It's 1970. It's a 42-year-old single malt, refill sherry casks. It's a Gordon MacPhail bottling. And it is 46% was put out at. This is very competent. This is held up very, very well, I thought, in the glass. And
it was made before the Second World War.
Yeah.
That's that's a historical timeline. It is whiskey and brandy and some rum.
Very competent. It's so intact after 42 years. It's Jesus.
It's remarkably
very impressed.
And like that is a single malt. The thing about Glenougie is that it has a serious reputation amongst the historical connoisseurs. It's rather like Milburn tends to I have had mixed experiences with Milburn, but talking to the
Can
people
you explain what Milburn is? I don't know. I never heard of Milburn before.
Milburn single malt. It's like Northport. It's one of these old obscure Scotch distilleries. Glenlochy is another example. Glenlochy was never really noticed.
Yeah, I have a Glenlochy here now to try next, actually.
Absolutely, yeah, there you go. The problem you've got, though, is when you try one stellar whiskey after another, you don't get a proper reading.
Yeah.
Because really what you want to do is, when you've got such valuable historical pieces, it is tempting, and particularly if you go to a whiskey show and you pay a massive ticket for a masterclass, you're sitting there having one stellar whiskey after another, and it just becomes a jumble. It immediately confuses your palate. You believe you're getting the experience out of it, but frankly, you're not really. What you want to do is start off with a glass of Jameson's or Powers, for example. Powers would be great. And just have a few scoopies of them with a little bit of water in it, so as the alcohol's not burning your palate. And thereafter, what you do is you have something that's not peated, that is a good, competent single malt, Scottish single malt, like Glenfarclas, for example. And then, after about 45 minutes, you may pour some of that Glenoogie, because your palate is ready for it.
I completely agree with you. I made the mistake of doing masterclasses at Whiskey Life. Too many of them ruined the whole session. But I did a Redbreast one, and it was a Redbreast warehouse sample. And I mean, like, there were 6 unicorns in front of me, and they were completely lost in each other, like, and it was, bang, 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 bang. And it was just, I just felt it was a bit rushed, and I would love to have been able to maybe take them away and sat with them after, of a different night. So I 100% see where you're coming from.
What you do, you go onto eBay and you buy sample bottles, you take them to the masterclass, and then you have a sniff, tiny taste, and pour into your bottle and take it away with you to enjoy later.
Yeah.
A masterclass is often the worst possible place to appreciate a good whiskey, because you're surrounded by peer group pressure, and everybody is there to endorse what's being presented, irrespective of what the quality is.
Yeah.
And even worse, you can go to some of these masterclasses and you have some expert or worthy, and they stand up and they bump their gums, bless them. They just keep bumping on, and they tell you this and they tell you that and they tell you all the rest, and you hardly get a chance to actually taste what you've paid to experience. And then it kind of builds up, because you've had this 25-30-minute introduction and explanation, and the whiskey's just sitting in front of you. It's really not fair. Every good whiskey session should start with a whiskey before anything's said, so that people can wet their whistle and just chill out a little bit, instead of being sat there feeling like they're lap dogs waiting for the bone to get thrown.
What's the best style of whiskey festival, do you think, from all of the whiskey festivals, we'll say, that you've experienced over the years?
The best style is where you pay your ticket at the door, you go in, you have a really good selection of producers and independent bottlers and other people related to the industry, who have their individual tables, who have not been overcharged by the organizers to be there, who are looked after by the organizers.
That's tough. That bit's tough.
Yeah, well, the problem is there's people organizing whiskey festivals left, right, and center, increasingly just because it's a good cash machine.
Yeah.
And this is just the reality of it. I mean, good luck for people to take the initiative, but when distillers go to these events, they should be looked after. They should be able to chill out and relax and chat with the people on the other side of the desk, who are not there just to trophy grab a huge number of whiskies, get pished, and then stagger out with the notebook. So they've got the bragging rights of 40 or 50 different things they've tasted.
Yeah.
It's partly to do with the maturity of the attendees.
Yeah.
And this is down to the husbandry and of the organisers to have security, proper security. And I'm not talking about the bouncers, although they're necessary. I'm talking about members of staff, visible T-shirt, that when someone's looking a little bit distressed or worse the wear, they quietly go over and say, "Excuse me, can we take you for a cup of coffee?"
Yeah.
Just give you some fresh air.
That's a very good point, Ralfy. Yeah, very good point.
The majority of people will respond positively to this.
Yeah.
But inevitably, as time goes on and people become over familiar with whiskey festivals and full of expectations and demands, so they'll be all crowded around the redbreast table, and they all want what's under the table, or that cask sample that nobody's going to be bottled, so they can toot off about it on Instagram or Twitter.
Yeah.
And you've got people now who are not, their enthusiasm is not for whiskey. Their enthusiasm is for turning a fast coin out of it.
Yeah.
And they see the value of Scotch whiskey going up, and they just love it. They would just love it when anything's released from an Irish distillery, the single cask. They'll go out, they'll try and scoop up as many bottles as possible. Then they'll pop one bottle into an Irish whiskey auction, make sure that the bidding goes way over the top, and then they'll absolutely bang on about it in social media. So it's basically unicorn it.
We've started to see that on the Irish whiskey scene. I'm kind of laughing at things you're saying here because I'm recognizing, but what we haven't experienced is a huge influx of independent bottlers yet in Ireland. We don't have many. I mean, two that jumps out at me is Di O'Connell with WD O'Connell bottlers, and Lockery as well are doing kind of bottling. Louise McGuan, she's put herself out in JJ Curry with the bonding, but I mean, and Ali as well with Celtic casks, but we don't have what you have in the kind of Scotch landscape with independent bottlers. What's your experience of independent bottlers? Because my impression of Scotch independent bottlers is they do go find those special casks. They do release those special casks. They're doing it for the right reasons. Is my impression correct, or what's your experience of independent bottlers? What should we expect in Ireland from this bottler group?
Yeah, partially correct, Laurie, in that a few of the independent bottlers have access to the distilleries in such a way that they can select casks. But by far the majority just get what they're given on the secondary market.
Yeah.
Because there are warehouses who are buying, say, 100, 200, 500 casks from distillers who are happy to sell because it aids them in the turnover of revenue, which is vital for the ongoing liquidity of their business. So there are times where the distillers have been reluctant to sell casks to independent bottlers because their sales are going well, and therefore they don't sell such good stuff. They ask more and more money for the casks they are selling. They get more and more terms and conditions, and for example, that an independent bottler can't use the name of the distillery when they're bottling.
Yeah, we've seen that.
It's competition, and it may misrepresent the brand that the distillery is trying to achieve, which of course is total bullshit. If anything,
do you know what we've had with some independent bottlings of other distilleries liquid? We have had brands having to sharpie out certain words on labels after the fact, before retail. So we've seen that as well, and I think that was more of a kind of a thumbs up or a fingers up to being told what to do as well, but we see that kind of messing as well, in the industry at the moment.
It is messing. It's arrogant. It's conceited. And frankly, distillers are not helping themselves, because this gets spotted and they look slovenly and unprofessional, as if they don't have enough confidence in their own product that they really think that independent bottlers are going to mess up their whiskey, when they, in fact, are acting as original bespoke ambassadors, presenting a quality and a style of whiskey to the market, which the official distillers are not doing because they're homogenizing and frankly sanitizing what they're producing, particularly if they're chill filtering and adding E150A burnt sugar caramel colorant.
And also offering it at a very, very low ABV as well, you know, not an optimum ABV. And that's been shown as well, you know, with a current series that have been released over the past 2 or 3 years, that a distillery's liquid is just fantastic at cask strength, and everyone's been waiting for it for decades, and it eventually happened, and it was amazing. But there has been kind of releases of that Northern Distilleries liquid by independent bottlers or by brands at cask strength, because they've sourced a cask on the secondary market, and it's proven to stand up, I mean, to most Irish single malts.
Yeah, another thing that needs to be reckoned with is that independent bottlers are often very careful about looking after the casks they've got. They store them in their own warehouses, which can be smaller warehouses where they're better cared for. They're in a cooler environment. They are not subject to a lot of vibration and disturbance from shifting and forklift truck activity. And so what you really have to summarize is that, particularly in Scotch whisky, the independent bottlers have been an absolute lifeline to the true whisky enthusiast who buys whisky not for the imposed, sanitized, marketing-led branding, but for the quality of the smell and the taste. That experience, that is the primary reason we buy, and the primary reason when it's not there that we start to walk away. And if they want to sanitize their product further and try and put it out to the mass market consumer who thinks all whiskey tastes a bit rank, but hey, it's fashionable, we better have a bottle. And isn't it great with Coca-Cola and ginger beer and ice? And look, we've got these lucky, Lucky Clover ice cube things. That makes all the difference these days, doesn't it? That sort of culture is out there, where there's a lot of lazy consumers who will not invest, not just the money, they'll invest the money in a brand, but they're not particularly interested in the flavor. They're too quick to consume it, and frankly, they're too lazy because it's just another commodity. Whereas there is this hardcore, and it's a relatively small group, but a hugely important group of high-spending customers, informed customers, people who have gone on a several-year apprenticeship of smell and taste. And in fact, several years down the line, can go toe-to-toe with industry professionals and outnose them because they've simply got a better sense of smell and taste. And the industry doesn't really want to talk about this. They want to acknowledge, and they'll give a wee pat in the head to the brand faithful, the whiskey customer. And they'll really appreciate it when this customer pays a lot of money for the anniversary edition, the annual festival release edition, the celebrating some birthday here, there, or wherever edition. And it provides a steady source of income for the better quality whiskey. But it's only down to whether the producer actually creates decent whiskey, quality whiskey. And one of the problems for Irish whiskey is the lack of experience, because you have got loads of people who are suddenly discovering their dream, their vision. It's my passion. I'm so passionate. I wanted to start a distillery, and now my dreams are coming true. Here's the crowdfunding. Shove your money in, folks. I'll give you some futures. I'll give you a batch of bottles as and when they're ready. Believe in us. So they go in, they start producing, worst of all, clean liquor. New make spirit, it's clean, and then worse than that, smooth. Are you kidding me? What are you making? Whiskey or vodka? Make up your mind.
I actually
It's clean and
detest that word being used to describe whiskey. I detest it being used, to be honest with you. And there's some brands who actually have it as their the main descriptor of their whiskey, and it drives me cracked.
yeah, because the last thing whiskey should be is smooth.
Mm.
The first thing whiskey should be is flavoursome. It should have that flavour singularity that brings you to that particular brand of whiskey, whether it be an official bottling or an independent bottling, because you cannot find it anywhere else. And obvious examples in Scotch whiskey are Mortlach, Edredour, Springbank, Glenfarclas. You know, it doesn't have to be a heavy flavoured whiskey to be distinctive. Isle of Arran has been enormously successful with a light, sweet,
amazing spirit, though. Amazing spirit.
And consistently amazing. Why? Because they know how to work the stills.
Mm.
They've got experience in the industry. They've taken the time to do their apprenticeship and not make clean liquor, to make slightly messy liquor, so as to give the cask something to do, some proactive, meaningful interaction between spirit and cask, so as that the two together amplify and create something which is more than the sum of their parts. And that is where you get a successful whiskey.
Like personally, I prefer a spirit that challenges me. You know, like some of the best fun that I have is doing blind tastings with my buddies of really good quality spirit, but trying to piece through and cut down and figure out what this is and what style of spirit and you know, trying to figure it out. Like we've great crack doing that, and I think that's the best education that you can get. You know, blind tasting spirit with your friends and with your buddies. You know.
Yeah, the thing about blind tasting is you've got to smell and taste without prejudice. So that whatever's there, there's absolutely no prompts, no labels, no bottles. And in fact, it really helps if you use blue glasses, because you can no longer even use the color to help you. Another option, if you don't have blue glasses, is sit in the room and have a red light bulb.
All right.
Because under red light, the color of whiskey disappears.
Yeah. Okay. Just before I forget, I want to just tell people what's in my glass at the moment. So this is a Glenlockie 1979. It's a 33-year-old single malt at 46%. And I was obviously I'm reading a few notes there because I did a bit of research. This was stored. This was produced in Fort William. So this should have been a sister distillery to Ben Nevis, or would it have been? I know the barrels were stored in Ben Nevis's warehouse for Glenlockie.
Yeah, I can't answer that. Glenlockie is one of these really obscure distilleries. It was off the radar. It was never on the radar. I don't think it particularly had a particularly strong signature. It's just that it is. Any bottles of Glenlockie these days are very, very rare, few and far between.
Okay. And this was produced as a blend component. And that's the thing, like, you know, that's what I've kind of find any of the kind of rarer scotches that I've gotten the opportunity to try. A lot of them were never supposed to be released as single malts. They were blend components. I remember doing, I did a podcast with Mark Rainier, and I had this old sample of Inverleven, and I said, this fella now will know, you know, this will impress me now because he used the stills that this was made in Inverleven, all the rest of it. And he said, no, that's muck. That was never supposed to be released as you know, and drink. And that's what I kind of find as well with a lot of these rarer scotches. There is just casks that have been released as single malts, but they were only ever produced to be blend components, and that is what this Glenlockie was produced to be like. You know?
And they weren't muck, no matter what he says. They were basically a different style of whiskey. It's really down to the casks. You can put the best of whiskey into a bad cask, you'll get muck. You can produce, you can put quite an anodyne, characterless whiskey into a good cask, At some point, it's going to sparkle. Strathmill, obvious example, really good example. Every now and again, you come across an old bottling of Strathmill, one of the most unfashionable, unwanted casks of whiskey on the secondary market. And yet, with time, in a good old school cask, not your modern. Can we talk about this, by the way? Your
Please
modern
do.
cask versus your old casks, older generation casks. This is a very important point because you now have a modern generation of whiskey coming out of Scotland where people are wondering, why isn't it got the substance and character that it used to have? There's two reasons. There can only be two reasons. One is the spirit itself and the other's casks. But in fact, it's not so much the spirit. Sure, with the industrialization of barley cloning on massive scale for the convenience of yield, for example, so that from certain strains of barley, you get more alcohol yield. But even as you get more alcohol yield, you get less flavor because there's less protein, because it's displaced by the starch in the actual grains. So you've got thinner husks as well. So you've got with some modern varieties, they'll produce great yields, but they won't produce great whiskey. However, we're still at the stage where there's a meeting in the middle that distillers understand that if they don't hold on to the signature, they lose their identity completely. They can't have too high an alcohol yield per ton of grain. They've got to have the flavor in there as well. And it's got to show when it comes through the still. Sure, they're running the stills faster than they used to generally. And in doing so, they're not allowing the same level of reflux. They're getting a hotter spirit and a thinner spirit. And people are noticing this because we're now at the point where people are going to auctions, they're tasting old whiskies, it's getting discussed. People are picking up on these conversations. And then they just get a wee taster and they say, yeah, absolutely right. But then there's the casks, you see, the casks that you've got samples of old whiskies there, bottled in the 1970s. Now, in that generation, bourbon was in better caliber of casks because the domination of the corporate multinational penny pinching wasn't as severe as it is now. You had fresher wood that had been air dried and seasoned properly before being formed into planks from which the coopers would construct the casks, heavier casks with thicker wood, consistently good quality. They would toast them before they charred them more deeply. They'd invest more in these casks because it was an age in which there was less hurry and the margins that the owners were demanding weren't as severe as they are now because they don't have technology to dictate that you can literally scrape another few dimes off the cost of producing a cask if you shove the cheap sourced bought wood on a budget through an oven to dry it out and kiln it in the space of a few hours instead of letting it air condition in a way that took several years in the old days. You know, time is money. And then, of course, the coopers, whereas they used to be paid on productivity. Now they're saying, right, we've got all the new equipment, we've got the nice almost self-assembly equipment in now. So you coopers, you can make twice as many casks as you used to, and you will be paid per cask you produce. And by the way, when we bottle our bourbon, it's going to be honeydew, watermelon flavor, apple pie flavor, pina colada flavor, all the shite that you see in the supermarket these days. And all the big corporate bourbon brands are at it. Frankly, you don't need good casks when you're making crap.
Have you seen any cooperages, be it in Spain, be it in Kentucky, be it wherever, producing well-made, well-seasoned, good wood barrels of late? You have.
You will
so
find...
there is companies and brands out there that are putting good casks into the market at the moment? Because if someone is listening to you now, they'd think that Jesus, all modern casks are shit. That can't be the case, can it?
It's not the case, but the number of cooperages who are producing really good quality casks is relatively small. Within the corporations who are doing their own coopering, everything's on a very tight budget. It's not about quality, it's about quantity. And they would come back and say, that's not entirely fair, Ralfy. You're tarring everybody with the same brush here. And that's not actually the case, because I'm acknowledging there are small cooperages who take the time and make the time to produce better quality casks, but inevitably these casks cost more. If the majority of your product is a consumer chugging product to be knocked back in bars in shots, you do not need good casks. Now, there are distilleries like Heaven Hill, for example, to a certain extent, Four Roses to a certain extent, who are spending more on selecting good quality casks, sourcing good quality casks, particularly good quality casks which are made with good quality oak. There's over 600 chemicals in American oak alone, and many of them contribute to flavor. Some of them overtly, like the vanillins, and some of them subtly, like the acetones and aldehydes that you get out of the wood. And when liquor is soaking into the wood and extracting these flavors, some of the flavors extract quickly, and others extract a lot slower because they're simply less soluble.
Yeah.
Now, if you've got decent quality wood and you've toasted it slowly, which takes more energy, takes more time, you've got more complexity there. And you really notice this with your French wine casks. Recently, I bottled some Kulila, and it matured in a barrique. And this idea that, wine casks, you're not traditional, you shouldn't use wine. Not what's the point, wine casks? I tell you what, wine casks globally are a very good way of getting good quality oak, good quality wood. And in this particular barrique that I got, which was an ex-Pomerol stroke San Emilio, to be honest, it had never been used for wine at all. It was surplus to requirements. But when you've got a really good quality French Bordeaux wine, you need to have your casks ready for the wine to go in at the end of your harvest and your fermentation season. And if those casks are not ready, that wine's either got to be bottled or it's going to oxidize. You don't have a lot of time on your hands, so they will over order the casks that they need. So, and because the wine is at a lower alcoholic strength, it takes less out of the casks. It extracts less from the casks. Yeah. And furthermore, these casks are not charred, unlike bourbon casks, which are frequently charred simply to try and smooth out the roughness of a very hasty distillation. Yeah. And why not when your bottles are going to be stacked up in a supermarket or Costco, because people just want to have a Jack Daniels and Coke mixer. People, an awful lot, particularly in the US, a lot of bourbon is consumed as a mixer. What's the point of even bothering with decent casks? Yeah, it's a waste of your time. But there are bourbon sippers out there, and this is where the small distilleries kind of capitalize. It's worth them sourcing the better quality casks, and perhaps even sourcing some casks from Europe, with European oak, just to see what happens. Sure, it will cost them to import it, but their marketing expenses are extremely low because they just don't need it. And by word of mouth and by putting it through their own forum and their own little fan club group, they can publicize what they've produced, which is genuinely interesting and brings a whole new quality of flavors to American bourbon, except they can't call it American bourbon anymore because it's not American oak cask, virgin cask, you see. What they'd have to do is just call it American whiskey. But people understand, people know. But it's still kind of, for small distilleries, your enthusiast is a big customer. And this is where small distilleries should focus. Whereas the big corporations, they're all battling it out in the supermarket, on Amazon, at Walmart, on Tesco, at, travel retail, where, the sellers are dictating the terms and conditions. And every bottle looks the same because they're all looking to be different. And it's all the same, fairly monotonous, boring marketing messages. And there's nothing particularly exciting on the outside of the bottle. They're brightly colored, they're a little bit blingy. And then you get to the inside of the bottle and it's a little bit meh because it's 40% chill filtered and caramel colored.
I see a great trend in Ireland, in Irish distilleries in the past 2-3 years, where the distilleries have seen the benefit, the cost benefit of having on-site cooperages. And more distilleries now are slowly but surely coming around to the realization that they need on-site cooperages. And we have now got, I think, 2 independent contract cooperages in Ireland, one on the West Coast and one in Kildare. There's a Kentucky cooperage firm after coming to do contract cooperage to the distilleries in the country. But what we do have, and what's really, really exciting, I think, is on the West Coast in the Burren distillery, where Noel, who was in the French wine industry for many, many years, came back home to, I think it's County Clare, and he is growing his own barley. He is malting it on site. He's distilling it on site, and then he is felling his own Irish Cecil oak trees, sending them for seasoning and coopering in Spain for whatever time it takes to air dry out, bringing them back and filling his own produced liquid into Irish oak. There's a lot of kind of exciting things as well going on, and people who are going to go to that level of financial commitment and who are going to go to that level of detail really, really need to be commended, I think,
I absolutely 100% agree. And the fact that you're highlighting the understanding across the Irish whiskey industry that to have independent access to cooperages is vital, absolutely vital, because we're now at a stage where there are too many distilleries in Scotland who are continuing to use tired out ex-bourbon casks because it's so hard to source good quality replacements. And in fact, there are American distilleries that are no longer even prepared to sell casks to the Scotch whisky industry. Some distilleries are going to order up casks and being told, no, we're not selling to you anymore. We're keeping them for ourselves and our industry. And this is something.
Is there any Scotch whisky distilleries founding new cooperages in their city? Like, is that happening? When's the last time you heard of a new cooperage being founded, we'll say, in a Scotch whisky brand or distillery?
Very good question. And some distilleries do have in-house cooperages. They're essential, absolutely essential. There are still independent. There's the main contractual cooperage in Scotland, Speyside Cooperage, which is French owned. And there is a small family-owned cooperage in Glasgow who just keep on going, because there needs to be diversity of availability of cooperages. But particularly in Ireland, the fact that you have time-served coopers is hugely important when you take a cask, for example, an ex-American oak cask, and rather than try and replace it, you can replace the barrel heads. And only a cooper can do that.
Yes.
And you can use inner staves. And only a cooper can pop those staves inside the casks and know the right wood to select for it. And it doesn't have to be oak. Irish whiskey does not exclusively need to be made using oak. And this is, not a lot of people know this, by the way. And this is a huge advantage.
Massive.
I mean, it's a massive advantage because I've done my own experiments in the middle of the Irish Sea in the Isle of Man by maturing, so basically going down the local wood. We've got rowan, we've got birch, we've got elder, we've got oak, Manx oak trees.
What genus are those Manx oak? Are they English oak?
They are. I don't think they're English oak per se.
Okay.
They are indigenous oak because they're basically, there's parts of the island that have kind of basically been left as private estate, and an oak tree's popped up from somewhere. It could have been brought across, but hey, it could have been brought out of someone's garden. It could have been an acorn picked from a previous oak tree that was getting clearing up a field. Who knows? You'd have to do a structural analysis of it by taking a biopsy. But what I can tell you, I mean, I've got a stick of local oak in my hand at the moment, at the end of a string, which I've put into my own whiskey, and the quality of the flavour from it is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
And birch works really well. Fir, by the way, there's people don't understand the flavour from wood because we don't eat wood. We don't drink wood juice. Oh, well, actually, we do. Birch sap, birch tree sap. I could source it in the Isle of Man. You can source it there in Ireland. There's plenty of birch trees. There's plenty of flavour in that. Imagine how sweet it is in the spring when the sap is rising, and then how much more complex it'll get in the fall, in the autumn time, when the sap is falling back into the roots. But there's so many woods out there, and you see it now in rum, for example, with Mount Gay Distillery in Barbados, who produced a bottle a few months ago called Andean Oak Matured Mount Gay rum. And they basically sourced some oak wood from up in the Andes, and quite resinous. They shipped it over to Barbados, where they basically either used it as inner staves or actually had casks made up using these pieces of oak. And the results were frankly phenomenal. And in Brazil, you have certain cachaças being matured in indigenous tree wood, ambarana wood, for example.
We've Teeling Distillery in Dublin has had some very successful experiments in their Wonder of Wood series with amburana. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, and it's a hardwood, Ralfy. There's not many whiskies that are not many barrels that have been constructed from a hardwood, and amburana is a hardwood. Interestingly.
And this is why the advantage of inner staves, because there's nothing illegal in Irish whiskey about using inner staves, they are a huge advantage. And they've been discontinued in Scotch whiskey by declaration of the Scotch Whisky Association, which has no legal...
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Fire away.
Has anyone in Scotland been using 20-inch 20-inch bungs in their barrels?
No comment.
I mean, to me, that's a very easy get around for inner staves. Stick in a 20-inch bung. There's your way around it, isn't it?
That is one way around it. And the other way around it is simply to ignore the ruling, because the Scotch Whisky Association has no right or remit to dictate to the industry what they can and will not use in the production of their whisky, so long as it is in compliance with the actual statutory law.
Mm.
That's none of their business.
Is there any appetite from the distilleries or from these Scotch brands to change the regulations regarding what wood can be Scotch whiskey can be matured in? I mean, you know, you can have a different category. Why not create a different category? Do you know, why have the Scotch Whisky Association hobnailed distilleries by using that restriction? Is it just a bunch of old lads who just can't get over tradition and are just hell bent on being stubborn about the rules? Or why isn't that thirst for innovation coming from the distilleries and brands, I wonder?
Pure complacency.
Mm.
Because at the moment,
That's not good enough.
of course, you know that and I know that, but you're dealing with what an industry that cherishes the fact that it's traditional, whether it helps the industry survive or not. The Scotch whisky industry has shot itself in the foot in the past, and it'll do so again in the future. Guaranteed. It's part of the culture. There's a real inbred culture, which is part of British society. And at the moment, while things are quite rosy, while they're getting the interest in the volume of sales, because the quality can be there, although that is changing, you have you still have this blind acceptance and belief that Scotch whisky is the best whisky in the world, bar none. And this, by the way, is a very dangerous form of arrogance. But there's plenty of it out there. And furthermore, Scotch whisky is overly dominated by corporate multinationals. Because back in the 1970s and the 1980s, too many family companies sold out their businesses to the big corporations so that they could chill out on the beach and not have to lift their finger and do a shred of work for the rest of their life. And again, it's just a cultural fatigue thing. This has been offset by a lot of enthusiastic new distilleries starting up in Scotland, not just making whiskey, but also making rum and other spirits. And I really wish them well, but the lack of experience shows dreadfully in the price of some of the bottlings and the sheer boring messaging that accompanies them. You know, if you're just one distillery, like it used to be Bruichladdich got all the attention to itself back in the early 2000s because it was the only distillery. It was the innovative, the progressive Hebridean distillery, but it's pretty old hat now. Now you've got about 20, 30 distilleries. It's very hard to look special when you're surrounded by all these other special competitors.
I just poured myself a Bruichladdich. It's the Feshiel 2015 bottling, High Noon 48.7%. Jim McCune's last Fesh, I think he was involved with. But Bruichladdich really, actually, I just realised there, I also have a Bruichladdich Glencairn. I didn't even cop that. But Bruichladdich really kind of invigorated a kind of a momentum of innovation, of change, of excitement back into the Scotch whisky industry in the early noughties. I mean, I don't understand with the amount of Scotch whisky in distilleries and brands, how that tidal wave from Bruichladdich wasn't seized upon and surfed over the horizon.
Well, good point. I mean, Bruichladdich stood out because they were prepared to be shameless, brazen, and engage in stunts in what is a very conservative and staid industry. And certainly even worse then, very hierarchical, by the way. And, you know, this is the way we do it. Everybody knows their place. We'll do this unique bottling, and once it's out there, we'll do another unique bottling. But we won't give it silly names like Yellow Submarine or weapons of mass destruction, stroke whiskey of much distinction, etc., etc. But the thing about Bruichladdich,
but it worked for them. It bloody worked.
It worked for them even when they ruffled feathers and bottled poor quality whiskey. It still worked for them. But, you know, if it worked that well, why did the bank that had financed them want the money back, and they were forced to sell to a big company against their will? So maybe perhaps they weren't doing everything right.
I think the English whiskey industry and English whiskey distilleries have been far more exciting in the past couple of years than most of the Scotch whiskey distilleries and brands.
Agreed.
Would I be wrong? You agree with me? Okay.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
I
I
agree
think
with you
so.
wholeheartedly.
I think so.
And the fact is, they're doing what they do without taking themselves too seriously and being full of pretentiousness.
Yes.
You've got Cotswolds Distillery. What they're doing, 46%. They may have non-age statement whiskies, but I tell you what, they don't bottle crap. And unfortunately, too many Scotch whisky distilleries are bottling some inferior stuff, putting it out there at relatively high prices, and just presuming, well, you know, it's fashionable, so it will sell. And this is really unfortunate, that the amount of chill filtration and the additioning of burnt sugar in the form of E150A, the fact that that practice continues so relentlessly it really is a shame, because particularly chill filtration, it sanitizes and diminishes flavor. This brings us back to the independent bottlers, Laurie, because, I mean, Gordon MacPhail do, because they're kind of covering the middle ground between official bottlings and independent bottlings. But you look at the likes of Signatory, who are a genuinely exciting, unpretentious, practical, jobbing, working, independent bottler who put out time after time some not always, but some really exciting whiskies.
Yes,
and
I fully agree with you. Crackers. I've got some great, fantastic Signatory samples over the years from buddies, you know, and polished off quite a number of their bottlings. Who do you think are maybe some of the more exciting independent bottlers at the moment? Like who are the contemporary, the good contemporary independent bottlers that people should maybe support and source whiskey from?
Okay, Lady of the Glen.
Never heard of them. Lady of the Glen. Okay.
Yep. James Eady.
Okay.
North Star.
Very good. I've got some great Kalilas, and I've got some fantastic bottles from North Star.
Yep. Dramore. Douglas Lang and Hunter Lang, they both do bottle some good stuff. But the thing is, you've got to be selective with all the independent bottlers. You have to look at a bottle and hesitate before you buy, get online, see what the reviews are, and then take it from there. Even better, build up a meaningful relationship with a specialist whiskey shop, because you can't do this in Tesco, you can't do this in Costco, it isn't practical. In a specialist whiskey shop where you're paying a little bit more for your whiskey, but you can trust the advice that the person behind the counter is giving you, because the chances are they've tasted the whiskey before they start selling it. Or even better, they give you a wee dram to taste and try before you buy. And this is another reason for the popularity, particularly in the online retailers, specialist whiskey retailers who are selling miniature bottles. They're doing their own miniature bottling. They're cutting down a full-size bottle into miniatures so people can spend a small amount of money to actually taste something before they commit to spending the full amount on a full bottle. People have to be fussy, because see if you're not, you start to buy crap bottles of whiskey, and they are out there. To the passive consumer, they're just another bottle of whiskey. But it's remarkable the diversity of availability of quality available to true whiskey enthusiasts. As time goes on, we will allow ourselves the occasional disappointment, but it's our money that's paying for it. And it's not as if we can claim a refund for faulty goods, because that's not the way it works. So we've got to be very fussy about what we buy.
I was in Edinburgh recently, and popped into a few of the whiskey shops, as you do, trying to suss out maybe some good deals, or maybe suss out who was doing things very well. And there was one of the shops who were selling 100 ml samples. So they were airplaneable,
Yeah.
straight from the cask, good little hook, some competent whiskies, in fairness. Was it Loch Hine, or Loch, was the brand? Anyway, but I really do appreciate that we don't have those type of shops in Ireland, and when you
Yes.
get to Scotland, you can, they really, really know how to look after customers who are looking for something a little bit special, a little bit different, and a little bit personal.
Yeah.
And it's massive, and I cannot wait till these shops start popping up in Ireland, because with Brexit, we're goosed, we're screwed. It's not worth our while buying bottles at British auctions, or shipping it over from Cadenheads or Master Malt. I mean, the taxes and the revenue charges and the postage are just gone through the roof. You don't know what you're going to pay once it comes across the border. It's such a shame that we've kind of lost that whole avenue of exploration,
For the moment.
Hopefully.
For the moment. I tell you, what you need to do is hire a fishing vessel, take you over to the Mull of Galloway.
Listen,
resurrect the fine old traditions of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, listen, if a lot of the rumblings coming from Scotland are to be believed, we mightn't have to wait that long for inter-EU postage again between Scotland and Ireland,
There you go. There's always rumblings of some kind.
Absolutely. I'm really, really enjoying your videos at the moment, Ralfy. What things are you concentrating on your whiskey journey at this kind of point of exploration that you're at? Like, what are the things that are really kind of that you want to dig deeper into? I know you're really concentrating at the moment in your videos on casks, and the lack of good casks as well that you're recognizing within the industry.
Yeah.
What else should people kind of be looking at apart from the wood and the casks?
Right, so people should be looking at the price.
Okay.
Because there's certain brands that have been premiumized. Obviously, Macallan is a good example. And the assumption is that if something costs more, it must be worth more.
No.
And I'm not buying Macallan. I'm not reviewing Macallan. I did buy one of their non-age statements out of curiosity, and it was inferior whiskey. I mean, I know what I'm looking at. I know what I'm talking about. And I really fear the worst with their new distillery. I think that it is a massive, big showpiece that lacks the feng shui, the actual soul needed to make good, solid, characterful whiskey. They had that in their old distillery. I don't believe they have it in their new one, and I think that is a tragedy. But
I think from tasting some modern Macallans, I think where they're falling down is their casks. I mean, I hate to go back to bloody casks, but I mean, even their age statement stuff, that 15, 18, 21 year, to me, it tastes very, very young. And all I can extrapolate from that is that there's feck all interaction between wood and spirit. So I'm probably drinking something that's third or fourth or fifth fill cask, because I mean, it's not a 15-year-old spirit on the palate. It's a 6, maybe 7-year-old at best.
Which is probably why you're changing to Glenallachie, where there's very clear evidence of a significant amount of investment in a tremendous variety of casks sourced from many directions. And at the moment, the original Glenallachie stock is being finished in these casks. But once they have been bottled, you will have these wet, primed, seasoned casks, which will be maturing new generation Glenallachie the full distance. And, this is the same person that brought us Glendronach. When Glendronach, it appeared, older whiskey, bottled at a younger age statement, at an accessible price, and literally it was the new Macallan.
Yeah.
Macallan have moved on to a different audience. It's an audience of high spending, fashion led pretentiousness.
Yeah.
But the rot set in many years ago. I remember buying a fine oak, matured 15-year-old Macallan. And previous to that, in the 1990s, early 2000s, I'd buy the 10-year-old, 18-year-old, and it was really good whiskey. It's the generation that earned them their reputation. But frankly, they don't have it now. They've moved on to a new market. It's not my market. I'm not part of that theatre and frankly, that shenanigans, that absurdity. So I just don't mention in Macallan in my reviews, because there's plenty of other bottlings out there. And I'm talking about casks because it's an easy subject to come back to, because cask interaction is what makes whiskey. Whiskey isn't whiskey till it's been in the cask. And across the industry, you're finding some commentators are bought and paid for enthusiasts are saying, well, it's a gentler style of cask these days. Casks aren't so important now. And this is just complete claptrap. It's just not true. Casks have never been more important than they are now. And this is why the industry collectively has to go out, purchase entire forests of trees like Glenmorangie did a while back, or I think it was Orzac, oak, but anyway, they have to invest in serious wood. It's expensive, but it's worth the price, because you can get more mileage out a good cask. After the first fill and the second fill, you replace the barrel heads, then you get your third fill. And if you have an internal stave, you have your 3.5 fills. You could even get fourth out if you have
a 20-inch bung.
Or the 20-inch bung, although that brings its hazard, because that I can see the theory, but it's the practicality of it. Or you could basically have interchangeable bungs. There are options, but it's the economies, the costs, and furthermore, there's the duty paid in Scotch whisky. The absurd duty. I recently bottled one of my own casks, and I was paying per litre of alcohol from that cask over £25. What's that, about 30 euros?
Yeah.
30 odd euros?
Yeah.
Purely in tax. And then when they charge that customs and excise duty, they put VAT on top of it.
Yes.
Another 20% on the tax. That is absolute exploitation. Ruthless unaccountability and exploitation, money being taken under the presumption that it's going to be used as taxes. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't.
Taxing taxes. Whoever came up with that, I'm telling you, give the man a medal, because that is just genius. Taxing a tax. We have it here in Ireland. We have it. Look, it's everywhere. Yeah. I have really, really enjoyed, followed, and copied a lot of your little projects that you've done. I've taken inspiration in maturing my own whiskey in smaller casks, in using inner staves, in a few of your, I've been very inspired by some of your videos. What else can people be doing at home to maybe educate themselves, in a small little cottage industry kind of way, to maybe give them a better insight into the whiskey and the spirit that we love? Like, is there anything else maybe that you can guide people towards to try out, have a chance of?
I would say to people, explore other spirits. Look at them alternatives. My first go-to is rum, always has been. A bottle of Foursquare, very good place to start, because what you're tasting is something which is totally and absolutely not whiskey. You're getting different flavors in a different stack of flavors with a different sensation range. So that the connection of salt sweet, sour, bitter, and savory, is different in rum than it is in whiskey. It becomes fascinating when rum is matured in ex-whiskey casks and starts to become fusion spirit. You get fantastic results then. But also you've got mezcal. And although there are quite a number of mezcals out there which are loaded with pretentiousness and greatly overpriced for what they actually are, you can, if you do your shopping carefully and have a check through the mezcal review sites, you can come across something that is, when you taste it, it's no chance you could confuse it with whiskey. And it gives you something, your palate, something that it's just not used to. Now, if you can't get hold of mezcal, have a look at some of the grappas.
Before you move on for mezcal, I think a good guide for people maybe is to lean towards artisanal mezcal, because there is subcategories within mezcal. And I find if you kind of lean into the artisanal mezcal, you're getting into the more craft mezcal and less adulterated mezcal.
Yeah, you've just got to watch the price you're paying.
Yeah.
Some are excessively priced and others are just absurd.
Yeah.
But there's never been more variety of mezcal available than there is now. There's others, I mean, I mentioned very briefly Italian grappa. I tend to, it'll take me a year to get through a bottle, a whole year, because I have it very now and again, very occasionally. I don't really bother much with gin now, because I find if I take spirit and drown it in soft drinks, I'm just basically drinking to get pished.
Yeah.
And I just don't like that experience. But Armagnac is another very commendable option.
I think French spirits are honestly where the value is in, we'll say, Ireland and in the UK, because they can't command the prices that they charge in France, because there just isn't the market here for Armagnacs and cognacs and Calvados and all the rest of the wonderful spirits produced for centuries in France. And there's really, really great value in Ireland and the UK for French spirits. I really think people are kind of, that they're missing a trick if they don't have one or two of the French spirit categories on their shelf, on their drinking shelf.
And it's also a very good idea if you're at a drinks auction, a whiskey auction, is to look out for these alternative bottlings. You never know where you're going to see some obscure old unknown cognac house bottling, which has been bottled in the 1970s or 80s. And it could be an absolute...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Ralfy, listen, thank you very much for coming back on to my little podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I've been a Pat Pal, a Patreon subscriber for quite a while now. And I thoroughly enjoy every video. I look forward to it every Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday evening. And I encourage people, if they have any passing interest in learning more about the water of life, if they have a passion for whiskey, your content is far and beyond the best out there. I can 100% guide people towards this, recommend it, and encourage people to check out your Patreon channel. I think you deserve the support, and I really do appreciate everything that you have taught me in the past couple of years. You've really enhanced my experience of whiskey and knowledge of whiskey, and I've taken, as I said, plenty of inspiration and done loads of little projects out in my workshop, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So thank you very much for all that you've given me, and thanks again for coming on to the podcast, buddy.
And as much as you appreciate the fact that you enjoy my content, providing this content has been a fascinating and very rewarding journey for me, which would be quite literally impossible without the democracy of the internet. And I'm looking back to, it's 13 years doing online videos, going right back to 2009. And
Have you looked back at some of your first videos? Because I have.
Yes,
In
I
your
have
kitchen.
occasionally. It's kind of thinking about. I've got to do something special for Ralfy Review 1000,
You should.
which will be basically my 1000th review, which will be popping up next year.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, but I've got to do something special. But
Definitely.
I've got a few contacts out there, so we'll wait and see. But to actually go on this journey, starting in a bar in Glasgow, down at the riverside in the Clyde. When I first moved into Glasgow, I went into the bar, bought a pint, and literally within 10 minutes, I was sitting at the table chatting with the locals who worked in the whiskey industry. And that's where it started. They had the grumpy old retired cooper who was getting barred all the time from the bar for making his sexist comments and, making remarks. You had the ladies who worked in the bottling plant and were cleaning up the offices. So they had all the gossip and all the shenanigans that were going on. So it was a fairly unique and very substantial introduction to whiskey, because when you're speaking with the people and they tell you a certain amount when they're sober, but they tell you more when they're no longer sober, and then they tell you even more when you're buying them a drink.
Mm-hmm.
So I started learning a lot very early on, and at that point I could go out to the shops and buy whiskey at a very reasonable price, serious whiskies. And it's just part of my character and makeup. I was obsessive with it. I just was a complete anorak. And instead of keeping money in the bank, I'd spend every last penny in bottles of whiskey. And then when the Glasgow's Whiskey Club surfaced, I was very quick to join, and you'd meet people in the industry and you'd meet other enthusiasts. So it was a certain moment in time where things were really coming together in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and I've never looked back. And the journey carries on. What happens tomorrow? Well, I'll continue to talk about casks, because I can see that I know fine well some people in the Scotch whisky industry hear what I'm saying, whilst others absolutely choose to dismiss me as just an arsehole and a nuisance, which in their eyes I am, and that's fine. I'm comfortable with that. At least they're showing the care, But I'll talk about casks. I'll go out, I'll buy independent bottlings and some official bottlings. The conversation will carry on because there's plenty of mileage yet. And what a fantastic, fabulous journey. I've been able to buy a few casks myself, bottle them, very, very few and far between, very occasionally. I've written my books. They continue to sell because they're just entertaining reads rather than traditional fact-based whiskey.
I can attest to that. I did purchase one or two of them.
Yeah, well, my third book is coming out at the end of the year.
Excellent.
Life, Death and Whiskey, it's called.
That's my Christmas present sorted. So
there you go. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure and give me your feedback.
Absolutely, as always.
And leave a like. It will be published by Amazon again, because I really don't have a choice. Publishers wouldn't touch me, Laurie, because I'm not really I don't fit the mold. But you can do it yourself now. And I'm getting far more experience and better at self-publishing.
Yeah.
And it's just a wonderful thing to do, to have that opportunity. Again, purely because of the internet. You're not waiting for people to hand you permission as to whether your face fits or not. That really doesn't matter. It's very empowering. And to pass on that knowledge is to empower people who have a genuine interest in whiskey to know what it is, when they buy it, whatever they buy, wherever around the world it comes from. And in doing so, to endorse, support, and highlight distilleries who focus on quality, and to body swerve those who disengage, disconnect, and send in the Wahoo marketing team to paper over the cracks in their faulty products.
Love it. Ralfy, thank you very much, boy. I really do appreciate it. Please keep the content coming, because I look forward to it every Sunday evening, Monday, as I said, and Tuesday with the old the extras, and then the Patreon exclusive videos. Again, I do implore people, check out the Patreon, look at your YouTube channel, and educate yourself on the spirit that we all love. And I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast can definitely understand our passion as well. So thank you very much for all you've given me, and I really appreciate you coming back on, Ralfy. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, buddy. Thank you very much.